Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. You sent in something really interesting this time about the Consumer Price Index CPI and how it all ties into the crypto market. I gotta say, CPI never seemed all that exciting to me, but getting ready for this, I realized it's a much bigger deal than I thought.
Oh, it absolutely is CPI. It can seem kind of like just numbers on a page, but it really affects everything from what you pay at the grocery store to even your investments.
For real. So let's start with what CPI even is. This excerpt we got explains it as how much the prices of everyday things have changed over time. Like groceries, gas, rent, all the things we got to spend money on.
Yeah, it's basically like taking a snapshot of all the prices for a bunch of goods and services that a typical consumer buys. And by watching how that snapshot changes as time goes on, that's how we measure inflation.
Okay, so inflation is just prices going up, meaning our money doesn't go as far as it used to. And CPI is kind of like the tool that shows us how fast those prices are going up, like a thermometer for the economy.
Exactly. And, figuring out CPI isn't as simple as just looking at a couple price tags. It's actually a pretty big process.
Yeah, they broke it down into 4 steps in here, starting with figuring out what goes in that basket of goods and services. Then they collect a whole bunch of price data for all those things. But here's where it gets interesting. They actually weight each item based on how much the average person spends on it.
That weighting is super important. It means CPI isn't just some random generic measurement. It's actually made to show how people really spend their money. So, most people are going to spend way more on housing than on going to the movies. So housing ends up getting a much bigger weight when they calculate the CPI.
Makes sense. So it's not just about whether the price of milk went up, but also how much milk people are buying. It's like a personalized inflation tracker.
Exactly. And that's why understanding CPI is so important for your own money situation.
Yeah.
It shows you how inflation is impacting your buying power and helps you make better choices about spending and saving.
Okay, so we got the basics down. Now let's zoom out a bit. This excerpt also talks about how CPI affects the whole economy, not just us as individuals.
Right. One of the biggest ways is consumer spending. When CPI goes up, meaning prices are going up, people get a little more careful with their money. Like maybe they won't eat out as much or put off buying a new TV.
Yeah, if everything's more expensive, you have less to spend. Makes sense. But this excerpt also mentions interest rates. How does that tie into CPI?
Well, central banks like the Federal Reserve here in the U.S., they use CPI data to make choices about interest rates. If CPI is high, which means inflation is being a pain, they might increase interest rates to try and cool things down.
So higher interest rates mean it's more expensive to borrow money.
Mm.
And when borrowing is expensive, people and businesses don't really want to take out loans.
Exactly. Think about it. If those mortgage rates are high, fewer people are buying houses. And if businesses can't afford to borrow money to grow, they might not hire as many people. So it really ripples through the whole economy.
Whoa, so CPI is like a domino that sets off a whole chain reaction. But what about our paychecks? Does CPI affect how much we earn?
Sometimes employers actually use CPI to adjust wages and salaries so their employees can keep up with inflation. You might have even gotten a cost of living adjustment or COLA before without realizing it was connected to CPI.
Now that you mention it, I think I have. It's really interesting how all these pieces fit together.
It is, and we haven't even gotten to the most exciting part yet, how CPI affects the whole cryptocurrency market. But before we jump into that...
Hold up. Before we get to the crypto stuff, I want to make sure I get this. You said earlier that CPI helps us see how inflation is hitting our buying power. What exactly does buying power even mean?
That's a great question. Buying power is basically how much stuff you can actually buy with the money you have. So say you've got $100 today. If inflation is high and prices keep going up a year from now, that same $100 won't get you as much. Your buying power has gone down. CPI helps us keep track of those changes in buying power over time.
Okay, so high CPI means inflation is eating away at our buying power. Makes sense why we should keep an eye on it. Now, I'm really curious about this whole crypto connection. How does CPI play into that world?
This is where it gets really interesting. So some people think cryptocurrencies, especially Bitcoin, could be an inflation hedge.
Wait, back up a sec. What does inflation hedge mean?
Imagine it like this. An inflation hedge is something you can own that either keeps its value or even goes up in value when prices in general are going up. So when inflation is high and the buying power of regular money, like dollars, is going down, investors get nervous.
Because their money is literally worth less over time.
Exactly. So they start looking for stuff to buy that might keep its value better. And some people think cryptocurrencies could be that thing. As CPI goes up, more people might start seeing crypto as a safer place for their money.
So it's kind of like a seesaw. A high CPI could make crypto more attractive as an inflation hedge.
Exactly. And there's another part to this whole CPI crypto thing. Remember how we talked about central banks using CPI to set interest rates?
Yeah, higher CPI can mean higher interest rates to try and fight inflation.
Well, those interest rate decisions can mess with crypto prices too. When interest rates go up, regular investments like bonds start looking better, and some investors might take their money out of crypto and put it into those safer, more predictable options.
So it's a balancing act. Higher CPI might push some investors towards crypto as a hedge, but the higher interest rates that come with it could make crypto less appealing compared to other investments. It's way more complicated than I thought.
It definitely is. But there's one more piece of the puzzle to think about. This excerpt mentions that if inflation stays high for a long time, it could actually lead to more people using cryptocurrencies. And to get that, we got to look at how people see regular money versus crypto. Basically, when people keep seeing their money become worth less because of inflation, they might start to lose faith in like dollars and euros and stuff. Crypto, on the other hand, since it's not controlled by any government, might start to look like a more stable option, a better choice.
That's really interesting. So CPI and inflation could actually push people towards using crypto?
It's possible. It's still early, and there are a lot of different opinions about whether crypto can really be a good alternative to traditional currencies. But CPI and inflation are definitely part of the conversation, and they change how people think about the future of money.
It's crazy how something that seemed like just economics like CPI can have such a big impact on new technologies and how we think about money. I'm starting to get why you said it affects so many parts of our lives.
It really does. You know what I like about this excerpt is it doesn't just throw a bunch of complicated words at you. It explains these complex ideas in a way that's easy to understand.
Yeah, I agree. Like the whole thing about how CPI is weighted based on what people spend, it really helped me see why it matters to my own finances.
It's a great way to see how CPI isn't just some random number. It's really tied to your everyday life and the choices you make about spending.
And speaking of choices, this whole conversation has me thinking a lot about my own money decisions.
Yeah.
Knowing the CPI affects everything from interest rates to maybe even crypto prices makes me want to keep an eye on it more closely.
I think that's smart. Whether you're investing in stocks, bonds, real estate, or even looking into crypto, understanding CPI can help you make better decisions and figure out the whole financial world, which seems to change all the time.
It's like having a secret decoder ring for the economy.
Exactly. Once you know how to read CPI, you can kind of guess what's going to happen and make smarter choices for your future.
Okay, we've talked about a lot. Let's do a quick recap for everyone listening, just to bring it all together.
Good idea. We started by saying what CPI is and how it's calculated, including that important weighting process that's all about how people spend their money. Then we looked at how CPI affects the whole economy. Things like how much people are spending, interest rates, wages, and government policies.
And then, of course, we jumped into the world of crypto and talked about how CPI can affect that market in a few ways. First, as a way to measure inflation, it can make crypto seem more appealing as a potential hedge. Second, the stuff central banks do in response to CPI data, like changing interest rates that can impact crypto prices too.
And finally, we talked about how if inflation stays high for a long time, measured by CPI, it could make more people start using cryptocurrencies.
This deep dive has really opened my eyes.
Yeah.
I feel like I understand CPI so much better now and why it's important.
That's what's great about learning. We took something that seemed kind of complicated and broke it down into smaller pieces, made it relevant to you and something you can use in your own life.
And that's what this whole show is about, exploring interesting stuff, learning together, and hopefully giving our listeners knowledge they can actually use.
Speaking of giving you something useful, this deep dive made me think of something interesting. With crypto maybe becoming a bigger deal, how might CPI's role in the economy change in the future? It's something to think about.
Wow, that is a great question. With crypto potentially changing everything, how do we even measure inflation in a future where traditional currencies might not be as important? It's crazy.
It really is, and it shows how much the world of finance is changing and how complex it's becoming.
So what about you listening? What really stood out to you in this deep dive? What's one new thing you learned about CPI that you didn't know before? And how could you use what you learned to make better decisions about your money, especially with crypto, maybe changing the future of finance?
Yeah, it's a lot to think about. We've only just scratched the surface here, but hopefully this gives you a good place to start.
Definitely. And if this has made you curious, we'd love to get more deep dive requests from you. We love digging into new stuff and seeing how things connect, especially with the world changing so fast these days.
You know, one of the most interesting things for me in this whole discussion is how CPI, this thing that seems like just a boring economic number, is actually so connected to everything else that's happening, like technology and how money itself is changing.
So true. When I first saw this topic, I'll be honest, I didn't think it would be this interesting. But there's so much to it. And now I really get how important CPI is, not just for the economy, but for all of us.
That's what's cool about a good deep dive. We take something that might seem kind of abstract and make it real and relatable, and hopefully even a little exciting.
Totally. Before we wrap up, a huge thank you to you for sending us this awesome material. It really got us thinking, and we had a lot of fun going through it with you.
We love it when you send us stuff that makes us think differently and learn new things.
So keep those requests coming. We're always up for a challenge, and we love learning with all of you amazing listeners.
And don't forget that question we asked. With crypto maybe changing everything, how do we even measure inflation if regular money isn't the main thing anymore? It's a real head scratcher.
Until next time, stay curious, keep learning, and happy diving.